So I'm going to show some things here. This is from some work done, not at SRI, this is at West Ed. It's a little power plant and lake. I would say it's a model. I wouldn't really call it this part of simulation. But what it does is it sets up an inquiry for the students to perform. So how does the power plant affect the lake ecosystem? And they give the students a scenario to work on, so they spend time understanding the basic ecology of the lake. They then try to figure out how this power plant being introduced would affect it. And they, in fact, come up with a plan for informing local citizens about what actions can be taken. The point I want to make here is simply having these kinds of rich digital resources enables us to set up situations in which we can have students do complex investigations. We can give them the chance to practice collaboration, communication, to be creative, and we can capture their actions. All of that is captured. So the challenge then is, how do we use that for assessment purposes? Because we have that information, so how can we turn that into assessment? On here, this is a life science simulation. This is connected with the same problem. And this is made, it's fairly simple. This is having students do a food web, and young students can do this. They're drawing arrows from the food source to the organism that eats it. And so, and things like this can be useful because you can also, in fact, do the instructions orally. And trying to separate science from reading comprehension, the student can use gesture, drawing, in order to show their idea of the food web on the simulation. Here's a case. This is a little simulation again of, it's got algae, shrimp, and alewife. Students can do experiments. So they can, just similar to what Dr. Noss showed this morning, where students can in fact set the starting level, how many algae, how many shrimp, how many alewife. They can run the simulation. They can keep track of data. And then they draw an interpretation. So they state a hypothesis, which you can capture. They run the simulation. They get their data. They produce graphs. And then they're asked to make argumentation based on their graphs. So all of this kind of activity, which we've thought of as learning, we can also think of as assessment. Here's another case. This is from work that Chris Deedy and his colleagues did at Harvard. It's a multi-user virtual environment. So so you move through it like you would Second Life, specifically to recreate an American industrial town, or though it's not American, or maybe it's American, I don't know where it is. It's an industrial town. Back at the time when scientists were just discovering and starting to understand bacteria. So what's happening in this town is students have avatars, and the students work in teams. They each have their avatar that can move through this environment. And they are given the challenge of trying to help the mayor of River City, who's noticed that the population is dying off. That means fewer voters, right? So why is the population dying off in River City? What's happening there? So the students can interact with each other. There are also agents that are in the software that are part of the software. So there are people they can go talk to as part of the software. They can move through the environment and, for example, take a water sample. And then there's a microscope, and they're observing here the number of E. coli in the water sample. So students conduct investigations in River City. It's a learning environment. They're learning by doing it, but at the same time they're learning. We're also capturing assessment data, and let me see if I can find. the different measures that they get from this. Oh, I could find that if I just went to the next slide. So they get measures of the science concept knowledge out of this, how well the students demonstrate they understand the concepts, their inquiry skills, and they also have a number of dialogues that lead to a measure of sense of efficacy as a scientist that they get out of the River City learning environment. So once you do the online learning, it's much easier to start integrating these complex forms of assessment in the environment. So the log file, I mentioned some of the kinds of things it captures. So here's another one. This is even more, this is more on the pilot level. This is from John Bransford's group at the University of Washington in Seattle, and something called the Life Center, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And so what they really wanted to do was to demonstrate what's possible if you avoid that drop-in from the sky kind of assessment we talked about, but really try to integrate it with an exciting, immersive learning challenge. And they also wanted to get at the idea that if you think about intelligent action involves learning from your experience. And they felt that the opportunity to learn from experience should, in fact, be part of assessment. So that you want to assess how much students are learning from experience, rather than having that kind of cold, where are you now? We're going to give you an experience and see how much you learn from the experience. So they set up a challenge here that involved middle school students again, and this is science again, but in this case it was around genetic counseling. So they were introducing a situation where they asked the students to take the role of a counselor who would counsel prospective parents. So the wife is pregnant, and they're thinking about getting pregnant. And one or both of them is a carrier for the sickle cell anemia gene, and that's a very bad, fatal disease. And the question is, there are lots of rich content here about the nature of the disease, the nature of genetic transmission, and of course probability. What do we know about the probabilities under certain situations that in fact a child will have the disease, not just be a carrier. So in this case, one or both of the parents was a carrier but did not have the disease.